May 6, 1944. A grey Saturday morning in Chelsea, London, a young woman walks into a register office wearing a pink crepe dress, not white. There is no church, there is no altar, no priest, no organ, no aisle, no choir. The ceremony takes about 10 minutes, conducted by a civil registrar in a municipal room, the way you might register a birth or a death or the transfer of a property. She is 24 years old. She is the daughter of the most famous Catholic family in the United States. Her father was, until recently, the American ambassador to the court of St. James's. Her mother is a woman whose devotion to the Roman Catholic Church is not a private matter, but a public identity, the thing the family is known for on 2 continents. And in that room, out of a family of 11, exactly 1 Kennedy is present. Her older brother Joe Jr. stands beside her in a United States Navy uniform. He has come, and he has come alone. And in coming, he has made a choice his mother will never entirely forgive. There is no father giving her away. There is no mother in the second row. There is no telegram of congratulations waiting at the hotel afterward. What arrives instead, across the Atlantic, is silence, and then something considerably worse than silence. Her name was Kathleen Agnes Kennedy. Her family called her Kick, and most of America has forgotten she existed at all. That forgetting was not an accident. You know the Kennedy women as the world was taught to know them. Rose, the matriarch of unbreakable faith. Eunice, the crusader. Jean, the diplomat. Devout daughters of the church who bent themselves around the family's ambition and never once broke. Kick was the one who said no. And the price her family extracted for that no is one of the darkest things in the entire Kennedy story. Not because anyone raised a hand to her, but because of what happened afterward. They did not simply disapprove of the marriage. Over the decades that followed, they quietly folded her out of the family's official memory, the way you might lift a photograph out of an album and never mention the empty square left behind. Consider what actually happened in the 4 years after that 10-minute ceremony. Her mother would not attend the wedding and worked to prevent it from ever taking place. The marriage lasted 5 weeks before her husband was shipped to the front. 4 months after the wedding, she was a widow. In one single summer, she lost her husband and the brother who had stood beside her at that register office. When she fell in love a second time, her mother threatened to disown her outright. And when Kick herself died at 28, exactly 1 member of her family attended the funeral. Not her mother, not one of her brothers, 1. She is not buried with the Kennedys. She lies in an English churchyard, in ground belonging to the family her mother could not accept, beneath an epitaph her own family did not write. So why would the daughter of America's most powerful Catholic family walk into a civil register office and marry a Protestant aristocrat, knowing exactly what it would cost her? What was so forbidden about this marriage that it could not simply be disapproved of, but had to be buried? And why, decades later, did a family that built libraries and monuments and eternal flames for its dead have so remarkably little to say about the daughter who died first? Stay with me, because to understand what was taken from Kick Kennedy, you first have to understand what she was born into. She arrived on February 20th, 1920, in Brookline, Massachusetts, the 4th of what would eventually be 9 children born to Joseph P. Kennedy and Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy. To understand Kick at all, you have to understand her mother first, because Rose Kennedy is the invisible architecture of this entire story. Rose was the daughter of John Fitzgerald, the man Boston knew as Honey Fitz, a mayor of the city and one of the great Irish political operators of his generation. She had been raised inside 2 structures that did not bend. The first was Irish Catholic Boston. The second was the church itself. Her faith was not decorative, and it was not seasonal. It was the operating system of her life. She organized her children using index cards, tracking their weights, their illnesses, their vaccinations, their sacraments. She attended Mass daily for decades. She sent her daughters to convent schools run by the Sacred Heart Order, the same rigorous, cloistered education she had received. In a Boston that had spent a full century informing Irish Catholics that they were second-class citizens in their own city, Rose's Catholicism functioned as armor. She wore it deliberately, and she wore it in public. And there was a specific old wound underneath all of it. As a young woman, Rose had wanted to attend Wellesley. She was academically capable, and she had been accepted. Her father, for reasons tangled up in church politics and Boston respectability, sent her to a convent instead. She obeyed him. She never entirely stopped resenting it, and she said so decades later.
Hold on to that, because a woman who once swallowed her own rebellion tends to be the least tolerant of it when she sees it in a daughter.
Then there was Joe Sr., ruthless, relentless, a man assembling a fortune and, through that fortune, a dynasty. He had been shut out of the Boston establishment as an Irish Catholic upstart, and he intended his children to walk into every room that had ever been closed to him. He drove his sons hard. He was more indulgent with his daughters. And of all 9 children, the one who could charm him most easily, the one who could puncture his mood with a joke, was Kik.
She was blonde, small, quick, and genuinely funny.
The nickname came from her high-spirited nature, and it stuck because it fit. She was not the great beauty of the family, and she was not the scholar. She was something rarer and considerably more useful. She was likable in a way that cannot be taught or manufactured. People who met her once remembered her for decades afterward. She had, by every surviving account, the particular gift of making a room feel warmer simply for being in it. Inside that enormous competitive household, 3 of the children formed their own smaller unit. Joe Jr., the eldest, the anointed one, the son who was supposed to become president. Jack, the sickly second son with the dry, sardonic humor. And Kik. One family friend described the 3 of them as a family within the family, a charmed triangle, the pick of the litter, the ones the old man believed would go furthest.
Remember that triangle. Within 4 years, 2 of its 3 points would be dead, and both of them would die within a single month of each other. The bond with Jack in particular deserves a moment because it explains a great deal about what came later. They were 2 years apart. They shared the same humor, the same allergy to sentiment, the same habit of deflating the family's grander pronouncements with a joke delivered under the breath. Jack was sick constantly through his childhood and adolescence, in and out of hospitals, and Kik was the sibling who wrote to him, visited him, and treated him as a person rather than a patient or a project. Their letters to one another are full of gossip and mockery and genuine affection. Of all the Kennedy children, they understood each other most easily. When the moment came that Kik needed her family to stand with her, Jack was sympathetic in private and absent in public. That pattern is worth watching as this story unfolds, because it repeats and because it ends in a churchyard in Derbyshire 19 years later. In 1938, everything changed. Joseph Kennedy was appointed United States Ambassador to the United Kingdom, and the entire family sailed for London. For most of the Kennedy children, England was an assignment, a posting, a temporary address. For Kik, it turned out to be a homecoming to a country she had never seen. She was 18. She was presented at court. She was launched directly into the London season, that dense and glittering and quietly brutal circuit of balls, dinners, and country house weekends where the British aristocracy inspected its own young and decided who would matter. And something happened that nobody in the family had planned for or predicted. They adored her. The British upper class, which had spent several centuries perfecting the art of making outsiders feel precisely how far outside they stood, took one look at this loud, funny, unpretentious American girl and opened the door. She was named the debutante of 1938. She was invited everywhere. The great houses of England, the ones with names, wanted her at their weekends. She acquired a circle of friends with the sort of nicknames the English aristocracy hands out to people it has decided to keep. Here is the crucial detail, the one that sets this entire tragedy in motion. Kik did not succeed in England by imitating the English. She succeeded by declining to. She was informal where they were stiff, direct where they were oblique, warm and immediate where they were cool and mannered. She made almost no effort to file down her Americanness, and that was exactly the reason they loved her. For the first time in her life, she was not simply a Kennedy daughter operating inside her mother's structure. She was, straightforwardly, herself. And being herself was working. That freedom is the thing she would spend the rest of her short life trying to hold on to. It is also the thing that would put her on a direct collision course with her own mother. It was inside that world that she met William Cavendish. Everyone called him Billy. He was the Marquess of Hartington, and that title contains the whole story in miniature because it was not his final title. It was the courtesy title of an heir. Billy Cavendish was the eldest son of the 10th Duke of Devonshire, which meant that one day he would inherit the dukedom, Chatsworth House, and one of the oldest and greatest fortunes in England. By every description, he was decent, tall, shy, serious, faintly awkward, without a trace of the swagger the Kennedy men carried as standard equipment. He and Kik liked each other immediately and easily, and their friends noticed it early. And their 2 families had been on opposite sides of a war for 400 years.
This is where most tellings of this story fail, because they render it as a simple case of a Catholic girl and a Protestant boy, which undersells it enormously.
The Cavendish family were not merely Anglican in the way most English aristocrats were Anglican, as a matter of birth and habit and not much thought. The Devonshires were one of the great Protestant dynasties of England. The family's power and much of its fortune were built on the Protestant side of England's religious conflicts. A Cavendish was among those who helped bring a Protestant monarch to the English throne in 1688. For generations afterward, the family stood near the center of English Protestant political life and had been prominent in opposing the extension of political rights to Catholics. Billy's father, the 10th Duke, was by multiple accounts the most hostile of all of them on the subject. So this was not two young people from mildly different churches negotiating a compromise. This was the heir to a dynasty built on defeating Catholic power, proposing marriage to the daughter of America's most prominent Catholic family, at a moment when both families still took every bit of that history entirely seriously. There is one more piece of context that matters enormously here, and it concerns her father. Joseph Kennedy's time as ambassador ended in something close to disgrace. He had argued forcefully against American involvement in the war and had been openly pessimistic about Britain's chances of survival. And when those positions became public, they finished him. The British establishment turned cold. Washington turned colder. He left London in 1940 with his political ambitions in ruins and his reputation permanently damaged. Understand what that meant for the family, and therefore for Kick. Joe Sr.'s own path to power had just closed. Everything he wanted now had to travel through his children. The Kennedy name had to be protected, managed, and kept spotless because it was the only asset left. In that climate, a daughter publicly abandoning the Catholic Church to marry into English Protestant aristocracy was not just a religious problem. It was a threat to the only thing the family had left to trade on. Then the war came, and for a while the problem appeared to solve itself. In 1939, with Europe collapsing, the Kennedy children were sent home to America. Kick went back to a country that suddenly felt small and gray and beige. She took a job at the Washington Times-Herald and worked as a journalist, writing and doing research. She was competent, extremely well-liked in the newsroom, and by every account, profoundly restless. She missed London. Her letters make it perfectly clear that she missed one particular person in London. In 1943, at 23, she found her way back. She signed up with the American Red Cross and was posted to England, where she worked at a club serving American servicemen. It was real work, unglamorous and exhausting, and she did it well. She served coffee and donuts. She organized dances. She sat with homesick 19-year-olds from Ohio and Nebraska who were about to be sent across the channel, and she made them laugh, which was the thing she had always been able to do better than anyone in her family. Colleagues from that period remembered her as unpretentious to the point of invisibility about her own name. Most of the servicemen who passed through had no idea that the cheerful American girl behind the counter was the daughter of a former ambassador. But make no mistake about what it was. She was traveling to a country under sustained bombardment in the middle of the deadliest war in human history, and every single person who knew her understood she was going because Billy Cavendish was there. What waited for her in London was not a romance. It was a piece of arithmetic that could not be solved. For Billy, the issue was the dukedom. Under the rules his family had lived by for centuries, the heir to the Devonshire title was expected to raise his own heirs in the Church of England. To do otherwise was, in the family's understanding, to hand a 400-year-old Protestant inheritance to a Catholic line. For Kick, the issue was her soul, and that phrase is not decoration. The Catholic Church of that era held a clear and unambiguous position. A Catholic who married outside the church in a civil ceremony and who agreed in advance that the children would be raised in another faith was placing herself outside the sacraments. This was not a scolding or a stern letter from a parish priest. In the theology she had absorbed since infancy, from her mother and her convent schools and every authority she had ever been taught to respect, she would be cutting herself off from the church, and by extension, in the way it had been explained to her, from salvation itself. Here is the detail that reveals the true shape of the trap she was standing in. According to the historical record, Billy's father actually told his son that if he married Kick while she remained Catholic, the family would not cut him off. The Duke, the most anti-Catholic Cavendish of them all, offered a door. Billy could not walk through it. He felt the weight of the dukedom too heavily, the obligation to the line that would come after him, the sense that the inheritance was not his to gamble, which meant that the entire cost of the marriage landed on Kick.
She was the one who had to surrender something. Her faith was the thing required to bend. And she understood with complete clarity what she was being asked to trade away. She agonized over it, and she did so for months. She consulted priests, looking for a reading of the rules that might let her through. She wrote about it. She turned it over endlessly with Joe Jr., the one member of her family who did not immediately condemn her for considering it. She looked for a version of this marriage that would not require her to abandon the church, and there was no such version available. The church would not bless it. The Cavendishes would not concede the point. And then there was her mother.
Rose Kennedy did not treat this as a private family disagreement, and it is important to be precise about why. If the daughter of Joseph and Rose Kennedy stepped outside the Catholic Church in order to marry into English Protestant aristocracy, that was not a matter for the drawing room. It was a public event. It would land in every Catholic parish in Boston and in every newspaper that had ever written about the family's improbable rise. Rose had spent her entire adult life demonstrating a single proposition, that Irish Catholics could reach the highest rooms in the world without surrendering the faith. Kick's marriage would be a very loud counter-argument delivered by her own daughter in front of everyone. So Rose fought it, and she fought it hard. She wrote to Kick. She worked, by the accounts that survived, to keep the couple physically apart. She applied every form of pressure available to a devout and formidable mother of that era, and inside a family as tightly bound as the Kennedys, that was a great deal of pressure. Joe Sr. was more pliable. He was a pragmatist by temperament, and Kick was his favorite. He looked for angles, for arrangements, for someone in the church who might be persuaded to find a form of words. There were none. On May 6, 1944, Kick Kennedy married Billy Cavendish at a register office in Chelsea. The room was full of Cavendishes, of London society, of her friends from the Red Cross. Billy's family came. Billy's family, the anti-Catholic Devonshires, the people whose ancestors had built their fortune fighting her church, showed up for her. Her own family sent one representative. Joe Jr. stood beside his sister and watched her marry a Protestant in a civil ceremony, and in doing so placed himself squarely between her and their mother's fury. Jack was in a hospital. Bobby was in naval training. Her parents were an ocean away and did not come. Rose Kennedy's response was not congratulation. She was, by every account, devastated, and she made that devastation entirely clear. Kick knew exactly what she had done. She had traded the church she was raised inside and something irreplaceable in her relationship with her mother for a man she loved. She had purchased a life using a currency she could never earn back. She got 5 weeks. 5 weeks after the wedding, Billy Cavendish was deployed to the fighting in Europe. The summer that followed was the worst of her life, and it began badly and then became immeasurably worse. She was in London that summer, and London that summer was under attack from a new kind of weapon. In retaliation for the D-Day landings, the Germans were sending flying bombs across the channel. Londoners called them doodlebugs. They arrived with an engine noise, and the noise itself was not the terrifying part. The terrifying part came when the engine cut out, because that meant the thing had begun to fall. Kick wrote about it in her diary. She described how people listened first for the sound of the bomb arriving, and then listened for the engine to stop. That silence, roughly 12 seconds before the explosion, was what Londoners came to fear more than the noise of any other weapon. Not the blast, the gap before it. That was her honeymoon, a young bride alone in a bombed city, waiting for silences. On August 12, 1944, Joe Jr. was killed. He had volunteered for a secret and extraordinarily dangerous mission involving an aircraft packed with explosives intended to be flown toward its target and then abandoned in mid-air by its crew. The plane detonated prematurely over England. There was very little left to recover. The eldest son, the anointed one, the brother who had stood alone beside her at her wedding 4 months earlier and had absorbed his mother's anger for doing it. Kick was in London when the news reached her. She sailed home to her family, into a house in mourning, and she stayed only briefly, because on September 9, 1944, less than a month after her brother's death, Billy Cavendish was killed in Belgium. He was leading his men forward, and he was shot by a German sniper. She had been married 4 months. She had lived with her husband for roughly 5 weeks of that. She was 24 years old. Understand precisely what that summer did to her. Kick had paid the highest price her world was capable of charging. Her church, her mother's approval,
Her standing inside her own family. She had paid all of it for a marriage that lasted a single season. She had given up everything she had for Billy Cavendish, and then Billy Cavendish was gone, and the things she had given up did not come back. She was now the widowed Marchioness of Hartington, a member of the English aristocracy by marriage. A 24-year-old woman with no clear place anywhere in the world. What she did next tells you exactly who she was. She stayed in England. She could have gone home. Grief alone would have made it easy, and everyone would have understood. The war was ending. Her family was in mourning and needed her. America was where she was from. She stayed. She kept the name. She kept the title. She built a life in London among Billy's people, in the country that had first shown her who she could be when nobody was arranging her. And Billy's people, remarkably, kept her. The Devonshires, whose 4 centuries of hostility to her church had cost her so much, did not treat her as a temporary daughter-in-law whose usefulness had expired along with their son. They absorbed her. They stood by her. They gave her a place. In the years after Billy's death, Kennedy was more fully and warmly accepted by the anti-Catholic English aristocracy than she was by her own mother. Sit with that for a moment, because it is the sentence at the center of this entire story. She became a fixture of London society in her own right. She kept a house, she entertained, and she was extremely good at it. Old friends describe those years as the closest she ever came to genuine independence. A woman with her own title, her own home, her own money, her own circle, and nobody organizing her life on index cards. And then she fell in love again, and this time her family did not merely disapprove. His name was Peter Wentworth Fitzwilliam, the 8th Earl Fitzwilliam. He was older than Kick, enormously wealthy, decorated for bravery during the war, and by every available description a charmer with a considerable reputation. Something of a rake. People who knew both men noticed the resemblance to Joe Jr. immediately. The same magnetism, the same appetite, the same streak of recklessness. There was one problem, and in the eyes of the Catholic Church, it was insurmountable. Peter Fitzwilliam was already married. He intended to divorce, and divorce, in the Catholic theology Kick had been raised inside, did not end a marriage in the eyes of God. To marry a divorced man was not a temporary lapse to be confessed and absolved. It was a permanent condition of living outside the church. Kick's first marriage had been forbidden. This second one, measured against the standards of her upbringing, was considerably worse. In early 1948, she came home to tell her parents that she intended to marry him as soon as his divorce was finalized. Rose Kennedy's answer was the harshest thing she ever said to any of her 9 children. According to the historical record, she threatened to disown Kathleen entirely if the marriage went ahead. Not disapproval. Not another campaign of letters and priests. Removal from the family. Joe Sr. once again went looking for a way through. He was prepared to explore whether some form of dispensation might be sought from Rome, something that could let his daughter marry without losing her standing as a Catholic. It was almost certainly a hopeless errand. But it was an errand, and it was more than her mother was offering her. A meeting was arranged. Kick and Peter would travel south to the French Riviera, and on the way they would stop in Paris to see Joe Sr., and Kick would try, one final time, to get one parent to stand beside her. On May 13, 1948, they boarded a small chartered aircraft, a de Havilland Dove, and flew out of Paris bound for Cannes. They flew into a storm. The weather over southern France that afternoon was severe, and the pilot pressed on into it rather than turning back or setting down. Over the Ardèche region, in the mountains, the aircraft came down. It crashed near Saint-Beauzile. Everyone aboard was killed: Kick, Peter, and the 2 crew. She was 28 years old. Her father was in France. He was the one who went to identify her body. What happened next is the part the family never adequately explained. Joseph P. Kennedy, her father, was the only member of the Kennedy family to attend Kathleen's funeral. Her mother did not come. Her brothers did not come. Jack, who had loved her more than almost anyone alive, who would one day be President of the United States, was not there. Explanations were offered afterward. Travel in 1948 was slow and difficult. The news arrived suddenly. The family was scattered. Weigh those explanations for whatever they are worth, and then set them beside the plain fact of what occurred. a daughter of one of the wealthiest families in America, died in a foreign country, and exactly one Kennedy stood at her graveside. Compare that with what this family did for its other dead. The Kennedys built libraries and foundations and eternal flames. They turned their losses into national monuments and their dead into secular saints. For Kik, there was a small service in an English village, attended by the Cavendishes, and one American father. And she was not brought home. Kathleen Kennedy was buried in the churchyard of St. Peter's at Edensor in Derbyshire, in ground belonging to the Dukes of Devonshire. She lies among Billy's family, not in Massachusetts, not with the Kennedys. In the end, the family that had been her mother's enemy for 400 years was the family that took her in, and the family she was born into left her where she lay. After that, the silence began. She was not much spoken of, in a family that recited its own history continuously, that told and retold the stories of Joe Jr. and later of Jack and of Bobby. Kik became the gap in the album. Her name appeared in the genealogies and almost never in the eulogies. A generation of Americans who could name every Kennedy brother could not tell you she had existed. There is a claim, repeated in a great many tellings of this story, that Rose Kennedy regarded her daughter's death as divine judgment, as God's punishment for the path she had chosen. Handle that claim carefully. It circulates widely, it fits neatly into the shape of the story people want to tell, and it is extremely difficult to verify. What the documented record actually supports is more restrained and, in its way, sadder. That Rose understood her daughter's choices as a spiritual catastrophe, that she had said as much with real force while Kik was alive, and that after the crash, she did not travel to the grave. That much requires no quotation to be true. It is simply what happened. And the silence held for a very long time. When the Kennedy family became American royalty in 1960, when the story of the clan was told and retold in magazines and campaign biographies and television specials, Kik was rarely part of it. The narrative that emerged had room for a heroic dead older brother and a martyred president and eventually a martyred senator. It had no comfortable place for a daughter who had walked out of the church and married the enemy and died unabsolved in a French mountainside. It took decades and a generation of biographers working outside the family's control before her story came back into view. That, more than anything else, is what I mean when I say her marriage was forbidden in ways her family buried. The prohibition did not end when she signed the register. It did not end when she died. It continued quietly for 50 years in the form of a story nobody told. Now, let me be straight with you about the sources, because this story attracts more myth-making than most. The serious accounts of Kik Kennedy's life come from a handful of biographers. Lynn McTaggart's work established much of the early record. Paula Byrne and Barbara Leeming have each produced substantial treatments. The Kennedy family archives, Kik's surviving letters, and her own diaries fill in her voice directly. That last part matters more than it might sound. A great deal of what we know about her interior life during the war years comes from her own hand rather than from someone reconstructing her afterward, which is rare for women of that era and that class. Where the accounts diverge is on motive and on private conversation. Exactly what Rose said to Kik behind closed doors. Exactly why not one brother crossed the Atlantic for the funeral. Exactly how far Joe Sr. would genuinely have gone with Rome. These are the places where the sources thin out and the guesswork quietly begins. Some tellings render Rose as a cold zealot who destroyed her own daughter. Others render her as a woman of sincere faith confronting what she truly believed was the loss of her child's soul, which is a different sort of grief, but an entirely real one. An honest account has to hold both at once. Rose Kennedy's opposition was not snobbery, and it was not spite. Inside her own theology, it was rescue. That does not make what it cost Kik any smaller. It only means the cruelty was sincere, which is somehow harder to sit with than if it had been malicious. So go back to that register office in Chelsea on that gray Saturday morning in 1944. A young woman in a pink dress. 10 minutes. No priest. One brother. For 80 years, that scene has been told as the moment Kik Kennedy broke her family's rules. Look at it again now, with everything you know, and it reads entirely differently. It was not a rebellion. Rebellion is loud, and it is aimed at somebody. This was quieter than that, and far lonelier. It was a young woman choosing, one time, to belong to her own life instead of to the machine she had been born into, and understanding as she signed that register precisely what the choice was going to cost her. She got 5 weeks of marriage. She got 4 years of widowhood. She got 28 years in total. And here is the thing her own family never said, the thing the Cavendishes said on their behalf. On the stone at Edensor, in that English churchyard where the Kennedys left her, there is an inscription. It reads, "Joy she gave, joy she has found." Her own family did not write those words. The family her mother could not accept did. There is one final visit worth knowing about. In June of 1963, the President of the United States came to England, and while he was there, he traveled to a small village churchyard in Derbyshire and stood at his sister's grave. Jack Kennedy had not been at her funeral 15 years earlier. He came in the end, alone, with the world's press kept at a distance. 5 months after that, he was dead in Dallas, and the family began building him the monument they had never once considered building for her. Kit Kennedy was not the Kennedy who was punished for failing. She was the Kennedy who was punished for choosing. Her marriage was forbidden by a church, by a dynasty, and by her own mother. And when she went ahead and made it anyway, the family did not disown her publicly or dramatically. They did something quieter and far more permanent. They simply stopped telling her story.